Hello, and welcome to the inaugural episode of Third Rail Podcast. My name is Maud Maron, and I am a New Yorker, and I'm the current candidate for Manhattan District Attorney, and I'm the most uncancelable woman in New York City. I'm also a Gen X mama in a podcast that is three New Yorkers, three generations, and one electric conversation, the Third Rail Podcast. I am joined by my two co-hosts. Let me introduce Ben Appel, my very handsome Generation Y colleague. Ben is the author of the forthcoming Cis White Gay, The Making of a Gender Heretic, and that book will drop November 4th, which makes November 4th a very important day in my life and Ben's life. Also representing Generation Z, we have Daniel Idfresne, who is my equally handsome but much younger co-host. Daniel is a multitasker like I am. He is both a rising senior at Syracuse University, where he's studying political science, and he is a political commentator. You can read his works in the New York Post and Real Clear Politics, and you can find him on a lot of different Fox News shows offering his smart takes. And as of today, he is a fellow podcaster. So Ben and Daniel, welcome. I'm very excited to start this venture with both of you.
Thank you. I'm excited too. I'm really excited.
Me as well.
We have, since we are talking about things big and small, we have, and national and local, political and cultural, we have decided that today we're going to talk about something that, a, that's being discussed in great detail in one section of the news media and largely ignored in another section of the news media, which is Russiagate or the Russia hoax or Russian collusion, depending on who's describing it and who's talking about it. But this feels like the story that both just won't go away, and also that nobody really understands.
hmm
So it's one of those things that's very complicated. And I have read so much and listened to so much about it over the past week. And I can't say it makes me an expert, but it does, it really does make it clear that this is a topic. And for anyone who was in a coma for the last decade. I'm talking about the fact that right before Donald Trump got into office, we were treated to the idea that he was either a stooge of Putin or bought and paid, somehow compromised by Putin, and that Russia interfered so much in our election that they basically made Donald Trump our president, and that Donald Trump and his various people in his campaign were somehow compromised. And that investigation that took up a big chunk of the first Donald Trump term, um, you know, that 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 was it was either a valid investigation that was important and that should have been looked into, or it wasn't, and it was really dirty politics in a way that compromised, who we are. And I know that you guys have both, listened to and read some of the stuff that's come out about it now that Tulsi Gabbard, who is one of those people who was tarred with the sort of, the Russia Vladimir Putin brush. Now that she's a director of national intelligence, she's released a lot of information that really shows. I mean, I'm going to be super general here and just say that really shows there's no there, right? That the quote unquote intelligence that was used to launch these investigations, and that, as someone who used to listen to Rachel Maddow a lot on MSNBC, to listen to endless reporting about the Robert Mueller investigations, the intelligence that whole thing was based on is really not worth the paper it was written on. I don't know, Daniel and Ben, when if you've gotten to that point of thinking it was that baseless, and if so, like, if you guys, what led you there, or what sort of, tell me if, for me, I listened to Rachel Maddow thinking that there was something very serious and problematic afoot. I couldn't always follow all the ins and outs, but I credited the people doing the investigation, like Robert Mueller, as like a serious person. And now I've gotten to the point 10 years later where I think, my God, that was like the weapons of mass destruction. It was made up for a political purpose, and it wasn't in any way real. So I'm wondering if either of you had like a similar pathway.
Yeah, well, and I
Well,
want
I'll
to say,
say for
oh, go ahead.
I'll say for my end, it's very interesting because this is before I really started getting into politics, which is in sophomore year of high school. Donald Trump first got elected when I was in sixth, seventh grade. So
Oh
we're
my God.
talking, this is about a decade ago. But it's very interesting because since I wasn't that involved in politics, what you would hear from the mainstream media was certainly law, right? The fact that Donald Trump even won in the first place, I was greeted to teachers sobbing and an eerie classroom feeling the next day. And for weeks and weeks on end, obviously I'm not paying close attention to it at the time, but I go home and on CNN, on television, the Russia hoax story is
Mhm.
being repeated again and again and again. And so I have that experience of sort of dealing with that narrative as a child in a way, coming home from school. And first, your mentors, your teachers, and those around you, the adults in the room, are crying and discrediting Trump's victory. But then you also have this Russia collusion narrative that's in every single, not just mine, but many Americans' living rooms, and bedrooms over the course of the beginning of Trump's presidency. And still to this day, there is a large number of Americans who still believe that that Trump colluded with Russia to steal the election in 2016, to win the election in 2016. And so
60% of Americans believe it.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So at least for me, I can see why that figure is so big. Looking back at that time of my life when Trump was first elected as president.
Hmm. Daniel, were your parents upset when you came home from school? Like, did you see them upset as well, or what was their reaction if you don't mind sharing that?
Well, yes, my parents were upset. Because again, that narrative was given as law, as
Hmm.
fact, right? And so, CNN, the most trusted name in news, MSNBC, as Maud said, all these establishment news outlets, no matter which news outlet you turned on, that was the narrative. That was the story. That
Right.
was what prime time was mentioning without fail, like day after day.
Right.
And so, my parents, who are not as political as I am, my siblings, my entire family, who don't care for politics as much as I do, they all believed it, and many Americans do, because again, that was the dominant narrative at the time, and
Hmm.
continues
And the New
still to
York
be.
Times. The New York Times covered it breathlessly and in fact has a Pulitzer Prize that they share with the Washington Post, if I'm not mistaken, for that coverage that, that was really propaganda that was being washed through the media.
Well, we can get into it, like the specifics of it. But and I think that for listeners, perhaps they've seen this unpacked by other people already or talked about. But again, it's not going anywhere, so it's something that's going to continue to come up. But I think what makes it such a rich story and so relevant and such great, material for podcasts like this is that it has so many relevant elements to the current moment. Social media influence, the media, believing the media, distrust in the media. That's a big one for me because, I was a Hillary voter. I think you were as well, Maud, in 2016. Very devastated by that loss. And I was a full, firm believer in that
Right.
narrative. I was very drawn into that and convinced. I vaguely remember maybe within days after the election, kind of searching for something on Google, and like the first hit that came up, and it was regarding Trump, was from a Russian news source, and I was like, "Oh my God, that's it!" Like this is real. This is really happening. It was so easy for me to go there because it was pumped into. It was like in the air. It was like you
Yeah.
couldn't. You breathed it in. It was everywhere.
And one thing that I think is kind of like fascinating and amazing, obviously, had Kamala Harris won last year's election, none of this would be happening. The Daniel, what you said about it was just fact. It was all over the news. We have so many people accepted it as fact. That would still be the case, right? The Biden to Kamala handoff, Trump would have been this anomalous, Russian president who was only in there for one term. It's the fact that Trump won and that we're now, and that he has, so there's so many people who in your life you want a do-over and you rarely get them. And Trump's getting like the most major do-over ever because now he has staffed his cabinet and getting, and putting people in place. And the fact that Tulsi, who was a former Bernie supporter and a lefty progressive, as a very progressive lefty Democrat, it's very interesting to see people like Tulsi and Robert Kennedy in this administration because it's, she she was tarred with that same brush, right?
By Hillary Clinton.
Hillary Clinton, who said, and here it is, Tulsi was and still is. She was an active veteran, and now she's in the reserve, and she had proudly served her country, and then she was being accused of being like a toady for a dictator. And the fact that she's the one who's getting to declassify and say, like, look, there's no there there. There's such a sweet justice to it. And I don't know, Daniel, to what you said about how many Americans still believe it. I don't know that that's going to change the mind of a lot of people. I mean, certainly Ben and I have gone from being Hillary voters to being like, I think I'm not going to speak for you, Ben, but I'm someone who is not, I don't think there's any truth to these allegations. I don't think the intelligence that has been revealed, the underlying sources and what's there, um, it doesn't make the case at all that there was a real undermining of a presidential candidate or a real foreign government buying into, being in control of our elections or influencing our elections in a significant way or having compromise on a president in a way that infringed on our democracy. I just don't think everything that we've seen supports the exact opposite, that it was, in fact, the Steele dossier was part of Hillary Clinton's, sort of oppo efforts to dirty up Donald Trump and
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 to
the output,
distract from
her own
her
problems.
own Russia
Yes, her
scandal.
own email, her own scandal with her email server. And the outgoing Obama administration, the information that's come forth really makes it clear that they were ready to just dirty up Trump, and they did it in the most spectacularly successful way.
Well, and I want to hear from Daniel, but I do want to clarify because Maud, you kind of speculated about like what I think about, where I've come to
Mhm.
to see this. I'm a very, very politically homeless person. I did not vote for Donald Trump this past election. I did not vote for anybody. Actually, I wrote in my own name because I was convinced at the time that I would be a better president than either of them. But I am really very, 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 very skeptical. I look at all these things. My trust in the media has been so destroyed. It's been obliterated, right? So, you know, I have to look at these things and not get pulled in by emotion and an emotional response. I do really I think the only journalist I really truly trust right now, that kind of regardless of anything that he says on this topic is Matt Taibbi. But even then I'm second guessing myself and I'm wondering, how much is he, exaggerating at all? Is there incentive for him to exaggerate? And also so how do we know these documents are real and they're true? I mean, like you said, it would go into the dustbin of history if Kamala was elected. It never would have happened. But now with Patel in intelligence and them apparently finding some room where there's all these documents, there's this treasure trove of Trump Russia investigation documents. They're able to see, all of this evidence of how from the very beginning there was no there, like you said.
Right.
Although the caveat to that is that it's not that Russia didn't, put out influential hits on social media, not that they weren't behind hacking of emails and so on.
Yep.
That occurred, but the collusion with Trump from the beginning was
Right.
not there. And that's something that they knew from the beginning,
Right.
but was consistently blown up in the media as if that were true.
I would let me say
Yeah.
one thing, Daniel. I would, since you're a political science student, Daniel, I'll say, and since you're the youngest one of our trio, I'm gonna go way back, not that far back, but just historically, like all governments, not all governments, many, many governments. It is the norm of governments trying to influence the election outcomes of other governments. Obama weighed in heavily on Brexit, trying to like influence the Brexit vote. Remember, like our CIA is fingerprints are all over, during the Cold War, Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, Salvador Allende in Chile, like our government was all over influencing those elections. Did Russia buy some Facebook ads or try to do try to hack emails or something? Like it appears yes, maybe, but like so what? That's like kind of like the barely rising to the level of, I mean, I'm not saying if something illegal was done, you should investigate it as a country, as a nation, sure, but like it doesn't rise to the level of most of the of above board influencing, Obama giving his opinions about other countries, elections, or the sort of the stuff that comes out years later about undermining elections during the Cold War. So I just think, and to your point, Ben, about Taibbi, I listen to the Matt Taibbi Walter Kern podcast all the time. I think he's very careful not to overstate the evidence. And because the English major in me will just say, because they're great book lovers and they talk about books as much as they talk about politics, that gives them great credibility in my mind. But
I
Danielle,
wanted to,
you take the
yeah.
political science point, the tack now.
Yeah, I was gonna say that I agree with both of you, especially Ben saying that even still now he's politically homeless. But we're all three of us are New Yorkers, and I think it's the effect of sort of just being in New York City during this time, when the Russia collusion hoax was the dominant media narrative. Like you said, Ben, it was oxygen. You couldn't get a day not between the news that you listen to, not between the friends, not between not and the teachers that I've heard from, teachers that I respect and trust as well. The sort of narrative, and it's just unfortunate that lies are able to travel faster than the truth, and now you have these establishment media, the establishment media, namely the New York Times, who when Tulsi Gabbard came out. And with these revelations, you can read directly on their lead and their thesis graph. Tulsi Gabbard attempted to discredit the Russia collusion fiasco, whatever. And it boils my blood in a way, and Matt Taibbi sort of dissected uh one of the New York Times pieces on trying to I guess debunk what Tulsi Gabbard's revelations. It boils my blood that instead of actually taking accountability, instead of actually walking back saying, what, we made a mistake, the New York Times believes that they can essentially get away with murder. You know what I mean? Like, they're reporting, at least for me, like reading that lead, it was so dishonest. Like, you can see the interest that they have in sort of protecting this story is so naked, and the way they word these articles, that for someone like me, you, Ben, and you, Maud, and other very discerning readers, we could pick up on that. Before the average New York Times reader, the New York Times know that the average New York Times reader isn't necessarily going to look at that article with that lens of, like, maybe the New York Times has a vested interest. They won a Pulitzer Prize. They're like supposed to be the most respected newspaper in America. They have a vested interest in backing this story. And to make another point, the social media, the fallout of social media censorship following this idea that Russia tried to help Trump win the election is huge. And we saw, the government doubled down on that social media censorship during COVID, but it really originated during that time, in 2016, 2017, in 2017, when, Democrats were really blaming Facebook and other social media, sites, for I guess, abetting
Right.
Russia's involvement in the U.S. election. And if it wasn't for social media, I feel as though a lot of Gen Zers wouldn't be in a position, especially Gen Z men, who now have most of their news sources, get most of their news from alternative sources. And so, this that attempt to censor social media because of it, if the Democrats were successful at doing that, the political makeup of Gen Z in 2025 at least would be radically different, if Democrats had their way 100%, which they've had,
Yeah.
in some respect, throughout the Russia collusion hoax and through COVID.
That's interesting, Daniel. I didn't really think about that, but you're right. That was an attempt. There were sort of, I forgot that earlier stab at censorship, which came from saying that Facebook was part of the problem in the 2016 election. I've been more focused on the censorship that came out of the COVID era, but you're right that there was that earlier effort. It was like they're trying different efforts. And one thing that you said, Daniel, that like about the discerning New York Times reader, I don't know if I'm the most discerning reader, but the thing that I think you're correct about is that there's a certain number of readers who don't want to challenge that narrative, who are sort of accepting of it. And the New York Times feeds their base a little bit with the idea that Trump derangement syndrome, the idea that Trump is like a unique threat to democracy. And and I guess there's a real question of like, how do they say like, how do you say, oops, got this one wrong on such a grand scale, right?
Mhm.
Like, how can they publish, they couldn't publish an op-ed by Matt Taibbi or by, the Martin Gurry piece that ran in the New York Post that said like, look, there's no there there, like
Mhm.
the New York Times they don't have the ability to put forth that narrative to their readers because they've had this other narrative that the Trump Russia thing was real for so long. So they don't have it. And then the other thing you were saying, Daniel, that's kind of interesting is like that Gen Z perspective of like there's a whole generation of kids who aren't getting their news from the New York Times. So it sort of doesn't like you read it, you're aware of it, you're picking it apart as a political science major, but for lots of people in your generation, like it's just not relevant to them.
Well, and with also the New York Times, I mean, you read something in the New York Times, it's very convincing, you know? I mean, first of all, there's this thing called, I think, like institutional awe. You know, we trust the New York Times like we trust doctors, like we trust, professors, like we trust, experts in whatever field. Now, of course, trust in all of those things has dramatically decreased in recent years, for a lot of us. But there is still that for a lot of people. And it's not like the New York Times gets everything across the board entirely wrong. There are things that thankfully that media outlet still can get right. But, with Daniel, you were talking earlier about Matt Taibbi's kind of scathing piece. I think you were probably referring to that open letter to Bill Gruskin, the former dean of the school at journalism school, Columbia Journalism School,
Yes.
who had kind of wrote this piece saying that, a piece in the New York Times, they eviscerated this whole narrative and so on and so forth. And what was so interesting about it was how subtle the journalists kind of serve as a mouthpiece for a specific party, the Democratic Party, where he just kind of throws this aside in there, like as if it's established fact that the reason why this is happening is because the administration wants to distract from their broken promise of releasing the Epstein files. That's not, and Taibbi kind of pulls different quotes from so many different, journalists and from different, Democratic politicians that have said that repeatedly. And so what he's just doing is just really repeating a Democratic talking point and stating it as fact, but how convincing and how powerful subtle messaging like that can be to influence people. When it's combined with that kind of institutional awe of there's the New York Times, like, of course we're going to trust them and believe them. They've been around forever. They've won all these Pulitzers. They're like, I can't even imagine what it's like in the newsroom. They're all so brilliant and smart and et cetera, et cetera. And so, like Hillary just throwing in a soundbite whenever it was, maybe 2 years ago or 3 years ago. Tulsi being the new instrument of Russia. It was so quick and so fast, but it gets out there and it gets so much mileage, and it does put something into your brain. Like it triggers this area of skepticism where, well, there's so much that I don't trust. Is there an element of truth to that? What is true?
Yeah, what you said is 100%. I agree. There's a sort of appeal to authority that the New York Times has, and you see that with at least students at Syracuse who are interested in politics. They will take a step forward from simply watching TikToks or Instagram Reels to get their news, and they will read news sources. But a lot of the news source that they default to is the New York Times, right? And the New York Times still has that weight today with those who still believe that it's 100% honest journalism, that, oh, it's a great lady, it's the New York Times. They can't really get things wrong. And, again, like the New York Times is not necessarily a bombastic website. It's not sensational like the New York Post can be sometimes. But like you said, within that Matt Taibbi piece, he mentioned the that subtle framing, right? Like all of this, the Tulsi Gabbard revelation is declassification, et cetera, is happening as the Jeffrey Epstein, as Trump is facing trouble with the Jeffrey Epstein files, and that's how the New York Times does it. Again, like with the reporting, the news reporting on Tulsi Gabbard, uh, Tulsi Gabbard declassifying the Tulsi Gabbard's declassification. Um, Again, like the subtle phrasing, like attempt to, in the nut graph,
Yeah.
how the New York Times quotes a Democrat,
Mhm.
Yeah.
that's a nut graph. That's the second paragraph. That's more like a comment rather than, a newsworthy quote that should be atop of a news report. But if, again, the undiscerning reader, somebody who's not really looking for that bias, like I am, or like many other readers are, will sort of take that as fact. Or Democrats said, well, Republicans are untrustworthy anyway. A Democrat said this, so it doesn't matter if a Democrat's response to Tulsi Gabbard is the second paragraph of a news report.
So I want to segue into something else, but let me just say this, Daniel, you got me thinking about it, is that like I really do think that we're in these polarized echo chambers of news gathering. I don't think most people read the news sources that they go to with the notion of wanting to challenge them or wanting to investigate the biases or what you go there to get news from a source that you trust. So you're kind and yes, the New York Times has this institutional heft and weight, and so people tend. You're right, Daniel, that there's this. If you read into it, you can be like, oh, well, that's actually an opinion or a bias that's slipping in there that's being presented as fact and the pieces that you mentioned, Ben. But I think most people are going to news sources, including alternative news. I listen to Matt Taibbi and Walter Kern because I trust them. And so I think I'm getting, more a credible, take on something. But I wanted to mention, since we're talking about the big national news story, which is the Russia news story, I want to come back closer to home for a second, which is the fact that a lot of New York Times readers voted for Zohran Mamdani to be in the Democratic primary. And I do think he's got a lot of New York Times readers. The breakdown in terms of the people who voted for him are college educated, sort of the gentrifiers in Brooklyn. Cuomo picked up more of the working class Black and Hispanic voters and some of the outer boroughs, and Mamdani seems to have gotten. I mean, he also did well with some Southeast Asian and East Asian voters in Queens and stuff, but he did really well with college educated voters. And that is folks who are reading the New York Times and not challenging those narratives and not being very skeptical about, the CNN. We're giving you the facts about things like Russiagate and COVID transmissibility and all of the things that people like Ben who's politically homeless, people like me who have found a new political home, like folks of us who have fallen out of our previous, lefty perch. Um, you know, I couldn't vote in the Democratic primary because I'm no longer a Democrat, but the people who did vote are people who are still very there's just a lot of people who aren't. If I talk to former Democrat friends of mine, when they don't know who Matt Taibbi is, even though we've all mentioned him like 25 times on this podcast
Mhm.
already, and um, you know, they're not challenging anything in the New York Times. They would say the New York Times is like the most trustworthy source out there. So I do think we're going to have like if Mamdani wins this election and he's poised to do so, he's going to be elected by people who read and believe the New York Times. I mean, do you guys think that's a fair statement?
I think it's a fair statement. I think there's a few caveats we need to add. When the New York Times refused to endorse Mamdani, a lot of people actually unsubscribed for the New York Times. At least what I've seen
Right.
on Twitter, and that just goes to what you were talking about, Maud. We now live in a country with two distinct visions of America, and with its own facts. And the New York Times made the mistake of breaking from those facts when they had a moment of clarity and decided that yes, Mamdani probably should not run the city. And I think the New York Times, when it comes to Russiagate or Mamdani, uh, the New York Times is now stuck in a between a rock and a hard place, right? Because they want to continue to portray themselves as an establishment news source that has trust and has a sort of reputation, but uh, has a prestigious reputation. But that's hard to reconcile with the America that we live in today, where those who vote for Mamdani has a different overall vision of what America is and what America should be, and the facts in which and the facts that those people care about uh, flows differently depending on that vision.
Yeah, and thinking about this, people talk about us being in a post-woke era, and it's like with Mamdani's win, it's kind of like this, it's very much alive still in certain sectors. Now, it's not like the 400, how many people voted for him, Maud, in the general, I mean the general? I'm sorry,
Oh,
the primary?
I don't know the numbers
It
off
was
the
like
top of my head.
I
400,000
may
or
be
something like that.
wrong, but I know it was 11 to 13% of New Yorkers,
Right.
so maybe, but
That's a
yeah,
very low
that checks
percentage of
out.
overall voters.
Yeah, I think it was like something like 400,000. That could be way off, but that's a number that I vaguely remember. Anyway, it doesn't represent the entirety of New York City and certainly not the entirety of the country. It's just really, like we said, a lot of college educated folks, a lot of really wealthy folks, lefty folks, liberal folks, a lot of Upper West Siders, maybe Tribeca, a lot of Brooklyn, Park Slope, Bushwick, that area.
Okay.
And we know those people and we know what they're like and we know why they did and how they did. And of course, they voted that way, especially because so many of these people are coming right out of Columbia, and this is, Zohran is Columbia in walking form. I mean, for people that don't realize, his father has been a very esteemed professor there, post-colonial theorist professor, for a very long time. His mother is a very successful director. And as much as they try to he tries to frame his story as like, oh, I'm eating with my hands because I come from the third world. Like in the New York Times, his mother is saying about how when Zohran was 3 months old, Denzel Washington was holding him on a red carpet at the premiere of like one of her movies. Like, I'm sorry. So, you're not like one of the people. You're a very, very privileged elite individual that's kind of posing as this whatever. But that's what they all are. They're just a bunch of posers. But it's kind of right after the election. I thought, okay, well, when there was kind of talk about, well, maybe perhaps Cuomo or Adams or whatever, if they can kind of come together, kind of decide maybe one of us will drop out depending on polling, so that perhaps we can get more of the independent vote and Republicans who are really intent on keeping Zohran out of office, like maybe instead of voting for the Republican candidate,
Liwa.
Sliwa, they'll vote across party lines or vote for an independent like Adams or Cuomo. Now Cuomo and Adams are like, in the sparring,
Yeah.
trade. And so to me, I'm like, okay, now, no, Mamdani is actually going to be the mayor of New York City come November 5th, or whenever he's sworn in, he'll be at
Yeah.
least the mayor-elect, November 4th, November 5th. And that's a really, really depressing and scary thought. Not just because of like the horrible ideas that he had, because I'm not an economist. So no, I'm not a socialist. I am a believer in capitalism. I do think that it works. I do think that it lifts nations and peoples out of poverty. It's not perfect, but what is?
Right.
But government run grocery stores and so on, that is something that I have not seen work, and I do not believe that it will work. I don't trust his $65 million towards gender affirming care. I'm a staunch opponent of gender transition for minors. I really recently, someone just posted online, and there's been a lot of fodder about this, about him, at the DSA meeting, folks talking about how they helped him form his trans platform. And, they're talking about providing gender affirming care to people outside of New York State, shipping hormones or having people come here and do that for them. And it's like, this is, they're like, we want to do what conservatives have been accusing us
I
of
know. I
doing.
heard that line. We want to do
We're
everything Fox News accuses of us.
right, right. And so anyway, I'm not for all of that, but what most depresses me is that these slime balls that walk the halls of Columbia, an institution that I went to from until 2020 and graduated from, you know, I really loathe the thought of someone, and not that he went there. He did not go
Right.
there. In fact, he was rejected from going there, even though he pretended to be black on his application. But, just the thought of someone kind of representing that ilk is just
Yeah.
a sad, sad thing for me.
Oh, he's a poster child for that spoiled liberal elite kid who wants to cosplay as the intersectionally oppressed person. Even his ridiculous attachment to Uganda. Like he lived there for a few years as a young kid. He's Indian. Both his parents are Indian. Like had he lived in Sweden for the first 5 years of his life and then moved to the Upper West Side. I mean, he went to Bank Street, a progressive private school that's a kindergarten through eighth grade school. He went there, up until high school. And it's like, had he lived in Sweden for a few years, he wouldn't be running back to Stockholm to have his wedding. But because he lived in Uganda for a few years, he's running back to Uganda because it's got, this connection of like my African connection. It's like you and your Indian self from your Indian parents lived somewhere else for a few years. Like people do that all the time. They live in other countries. It doesn't mean you are of that country or from that country. I mean, military brats do it all the time. You bop around from country to country to country, and you may have an affection in your heart for a place you live, but you're not of that place. He's not part African because his family lived in Uganda for a few years. Like, give me a break on that
Well,
one.
and he's not returning for his wedding. He's not returning to like the villages of Uganda. He's there. It's his family's compound that has,
To the compound.
security guards, guarding it, and
Yeah.
phones, I believe that what were jammed, as far
Yeah.
as I
Yeah.
understand, of the guest,
Yeah.
which freaks me out because it's like one can only imagine the conversations that went down there where no one was afraid of being, recorded or any sound bites getting out of there. And for them to be able to talk freely. Not that Zohran doesn't talk freely about what his agenda is. And it's not like I don't think that he actually believes some of the things that he says. I do think that he is really radical because he comes from that space. His parents are extremely radical. They're extremely anti-Western, extremely anti-Israel,
They're
specifically anti-Israel.
anti-American, they're anti-Israel, and they're anti-capitalism. Like
Right.
they're anti-white people. Like they are the full complement of radical. One thing I'll say about the guy is he's refreshingly honest. Like all he wears all his hatreds on his sleeve. You know what I mean? Like he
But
does it.
what's dangerous is that he does it with a smile on his face. I mean, every single time uh he comes up with these ideas like city-owned grocery stores or the fact that billionaires shouldn't exist or the idea that we should freeze a Reddit comes with a smile on his face. He's packaging these really damaging ideas that will be damaging for the working class as something that's good, as like sunshine and rainbows. And Ben, you talked a lot about sort of the demographic makeup of those who support Zohran Mamdani is really the newly settled young professional type of New Yorker who have entered places like Bushwick and Williamsburg and Astoria. Uh, and I think that a lot of Zoran's policies will end up accelerating that gentrification. Will end up accelerating sort of the flight of families out of New York City, particularly when you're talking about. We could talk about Zoran's reductive immigration rhetoric, right? How he completely dismisses sort of the market distortions that we've been seeing in New York City since the summer of 2021, right? I'm not an economist either, but I've taken basic economic classes to know that in the labor market, there's a supply and there's demand. And when it comes to labor supply, if you import a large amount of new workers within working class labor markets specifically, so no, the matcha drinking Williamsburg, young professional won't feel the market effects, but working class New Yorkers, construction workers, et cetera, will when the supply, the labor supply has increased. Businesses and those who need that labor now can pick from more people and people who aren't subject to the minimum wage laws in New York City, right? And that's only one of the ways. Another really damaging policy is defunding the police. And New York City affordability has been the first sort of point of interest for New Yorkers in this election. But I guess we're all quick to forget that safety was the first for the previous mayoral election, the one that got Mayor Adams elected. And it was Mayor Adams' pro-police policy that has allowed us to enjoy, the city at one of its safest points in history, between Eric Adams and Jessica Tisch, our commissioner.
Well, I'm going to have to really disagree with you now, my man. We're not at
Oh,
the
okay.
safest point in history, but we are certainly in a much better place
A much better place
than we
yeah.
would have been had we elected Maya Wiley over Eric Adams. And also, Daniel, you're right that safety was the big issue, but also like Eric Adams eked out that win over the Zohran Mamdani of that election, which was Maya Wiley. And the thing
Mm-hmm.
that frustrates me so much is that a lot of people voted for Eric Adams, not because they thought he was perfect. We're always voting for these imperfect candidates, but because he wasn't the lefty sort of anti-capitalist, defund the police, nut job Maya Wiley. So we like fended off that leftist extremist 4 years ago only to wind up with a much more distilled version of all those bad ideas in Zohran Mamdani, right? And yes, I think you're right, Daniel, that New York hasn't gotten as bad as like LA or San Francisco in terms of, but it's pretty bad. Excuse me, in terms of what our safety looks like, what the subways look like, what the streets look like, what our parks look like. I live downtown at Manhattan. You see people shooting up on the streets in the last few years, which you used to never see because you used to get arrested if you did that. And we're living in, it's like the frog that's being boiled in the pot. Like it's people don't realize how bad it's getting because if we went back 7 years and then jumped here, you'd be like, oh my God, what happened to the city? Like it's filthy and all these crazy people are doing drugs in the open in the park. But because it happens bit by bit, day by day, people like get used to it. And yes, I'll get, you mentioned Jessica Tish, like, yes, we're in a little bit better shape than some of the other cities that really went off the rails, but it's not good enough and it's not what people voted for when they tried to vote in a pro-safety mayor.
I guess I should modify my statement then. I no, that's
I
it's convincing.
confess to
I
having a
agree
vested
with you.
interest as a politician running on a very pro-police platform, but I think
Right.
that actually back me up.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
you're running
no,
against Alvin Bragg, who,
Yes.
who I guess you contend a big part of the problem is that, as far as I know, being a DA kind of is letting people off or not, prosecuting how he should be, which is
Right.
putting a lot of criminals back onto the streets to reoffend.
And
Is
Alvin
that
Bragg
what
hides
you're saying
behind,
happens?
yes, Alvin Bragg is a huge part of the problem in Manhattan. It's only one out of the five boroughs, but we see some of the safety in all of the boroughs. And Alvin Bragg hides behind, with some legitimacy, the changes that happened in Albany in 2019 when we changed all of our laws. But even with those laws making it harder for prosecutors to prosecute certain cases, Alvin Bragg came into office announcing what he would not prosecute. Not that he could not, but what he would not. You can still prosecute resisting arrest. You can still prosecute fair beat or pettit larceny when people go into a Dwayne Reed and steal shampoo and toothpaste. You can still prosecute that. But Alvin Bragg said he's not going to. So that's that extremist version of our city that Zohran Mamdani wants to accelerate. Like he doesn't want to, I want to fix what Alvin Bragg is getting wrong. Zohran Mamdani wants to lean into it.
Mhm.
yeah, and we see that with his stance on the strategic response group (SRG). A lot of I guess the socialist criticism of SRG is New York. We have to protect New Yorkers' First Amendment rights, right? And Mamdani has sort of walked away from the defund the police talking
He
point,
packaged
but
it
I
though,
don't.
Daniel.
But he repackaged it
Yeah.
exactly. I when you look at his platform on the website, he wants to create the Department of Community Safety, but he doesn't specify where he's going to get half of its funding. And he may not explicitly say, "Well, we're going to defund the police," but when you have that sort of rhetoric that you want to remove the strategic response group or completely disband it, well, that's going to free up some budget
Okay,
for your
let me just say
Department
that
of
this is
Community
like
Safety.
this. Oh my gosh, this is the sort of hypocrisy that drives me right over the edge. When he flew back to Uganda to have his soiree and his fete for his wedding, what a perfect opportunity to say, "Let me show you how the what does he call it? The community of safety development. What is
What?
it? What
Yeah,
is
that.
Department of Community Safety, I believe.
Department of Community Safety. He could have said, let me show you how the Department of Community Safety will work. And he could have had all his social worky Department of Community Safety people provide security at his compound. But no, he had armed security guards. He jammed the phones. He did all of the things that are like high tech, super security methodology, all the stuff he doesn't want us to have here in New York when our kids are taking the subway to school or we're, coming home from work. He doesn't want, and I'm sorry, but that's just the the people who have been proponents of defund the police know how unpopular it is, so they reword it. Like the Department of Community Safety is a reworded defund the police because it's like an extra hop, skip, and a jump to defund the police. Because instead of just saying take away the money, you're saying we're going to fund this other thing. And how are we going to fund it? Oh, we're going to take the money that would otherwise be used for the NYPD and use it to fund. Well, that sounds an awful lot like defunding the police to me. So look, it gets too depressing to think about how terrible he's going to be because I think if you're a betting person, as long as Sliwa, Adams, and Cuomo are splitting the vote, they are helping getting him elected.
Right. And that's a big problem. And so they need to really man up and figure out what they're going to do here and not be sparring like it's a typical election. If they really do care about the city of New York and they are really concerned about him being elected mayor, then they really do need to prove that they care that much. And for the record, Zohran, good for him that he got married. Good for him that he went to good for him that he affords it. But like Maud said, it's the hypocrisy. Like that is what this kind of double speak and talking as if you're one way and living in another. That's what's just so dreadful. But it's represented again in the demographic that voted for him. The privileged, elites, if you want to call that, but more wealthier, college educated, Columbia educated, specifically NYU educated, kids and young people and graduates that are coming out of those schools that are, organizing all of these everybody's an organizer today, and they're all organizing to get leftist politicians, DSA candidates elected. Zohran being the main example of that, and they're saying we know what's best for the working class, we know what's best for minorities, we know what's best for you. Trust us. And meanwhile, the policies, like you said, Daniel, that they're proposing are the ones that are going to be hurting the working class that they're hoping to save. But back to the thing about people leaving the city, and you were talking about that concern, Daniel. Again, what I understand is that people talk about how specifically with this kind of socialist, reformation or revolution of government, let's say in New York or in a citywide basis, like the five boroughs. What I understand is that the big concern is that the wealthier people, the people who are going to leave because they're like, I'm not going to fund and pay for, you know, what the city is asking of me. And so then eventually that's kind of how the things deteriorate. Am I reading that right? Is that correct? Is that a realistic concern?
Well, it's not only wealthier. The two demographics that constitutes a stable tax base for New York will are leaving in higher numbers than Americans who are typically college educated, age 18 to 29. New York City has experienced a net influx of that type of American for decades now, while experiencing a net outflow of families. And we've seen that more and more wealthier New Yorkers, whether they're a family or not, they're deciding to move to places like Texas and Florida. And those two type of New Yorkers represent a stable tax base, right?
Hmm.
Longtime residents with families who have stake in their communities, and wealthier New Yorkers who pay so much taxes in New York State that pretty much funds a lot of the ideas that Zohran wants to implement. Um, those people will be more inclined to leave. And it doesn't help when Zoran goes on national television and say that billionaires should not exist, right? The Gristedes supermarket chain owner threatened to leave New York City if Zoran implemented city-run grocery stores. Now, again, Zoran will go on national television and say, well, billionaires shouldn't exist. And his earnest supporters would probably say, well, boo-hoo,
Right.
we're not going to miss you anyway. But the problem is that the Christie's supermarket chain owner, I believe his name is John Casamidis or uh,
Casamatides.
Casamatides. He sort of represents the attitudes of anyone who owns a supermarket or a
Business.
bodega
Yeah.
in the city. And not all of them are billionaires, but all of them are business minded, and a lot of them have families. They represent that other side, the stable family tax base in New York City, and they may not be billionaires, but they have the same concerns. And so I just think that's very arrogant for those like Mamdani and his supporters to, uh, you know, dismiss their
Oh,
concerns.
yeah, there's a lot of arrogance to go around. And speaking of arrogance, let me say we had discussed, gentlemen, making some predictions about things that might happen between now and then, which some people might think is arrogant, that we know what's going to happen or that we can figure it out. And by no means do I mean to be arrogant when I say this, but I'm up to the challenge of making some predictions of things that might happen between now and when we meet again. Um, I'll go first if you guys,
Go for
if you
it.
want to throw out your predictions too. I am I am convinced we're going to see indictments on the Russian cover up and the Russian hoax issue. It seems to me with Pam Bondi and the Trump administration in general, they're not afraid to you know, to go where the evidence allows them to go. I mean, there's the evidence may allow them to go there, and a political the issue may be we don't want to do that. It won't be good, but I think we're going to see indictments, and I think, I don't think you're going to see them go after Obama, as some people have said. I think that's a bridge too far, probably, but I do think we're going to see indictments, and I wouldn't be surprised if we saw it in the sort of the intelligence community. So that's my prediction that we're going to see indictments.
Hmm.
How about
Daniel,
Do
you,
you
what
have
Dave?
a
about?
prediction, Ben?
No, I'm formulating mine. Continue. Do you have something
Mm.
ready?
Well, I'm thinking, if I had to make a prediction, um, I think that Adams and Cuomo signed a pledge, uh, that he would drop out of the race, or I think he pledged. I don't know if it's official, but he sort of echoed Jim Walden and saying that he's going to drop out.
Proposed that
Yeah.
when they did a poll in September, whoever was doing, if he wasn't doing well, as well as the other
Hmm.
ones, he would drop out. That was his
Yeah.
proposal.
I don't think he will. I think by September, there will be some sort of internal polling, some sort of internal polling that he will probably refer to say that, like, Eric Adams is more unpopular than me. He should drop out, and some of the polls is showing that Eric Adams is dragging behind Silva and Cuomo, and Eric Adams won't drop out, and we're going to be stuck in a situation that we are right now in September and October as we get into the heat of the election.
So you think
Yeah.
they're all going to be on the ballot?
Yeah, because Eric Adams, like, he's the incumbent, so that alone, like,
Right.
he won't get off the ballot. I don't think
Oh,
Siwa will
Lordy,
either.
I'm afraid. Yeah.
And with these predictions specifically, we're talking about it can be any kind of long term, short term. It's not before we meet again in terms of before we record our next podcast next week, but just anything that
I'll
comes
say
down the line.
indictments in August to
I was
give it
gonna
a,
say you think it's going to be that soon,
yeah.
but haven't this subpoenas? I mean, they've subpoenaed the Clintons, I believe, right? And they've
You
subpoenaed.
don't need to wait for a subpoena return to issue an indictment. And I think there are some statute of limitation issues that are going to be pushing them to indict sooner rather than later.
Oh, I see. Okay, because I would just imagine that these kind of hearings would take place first before those indictments
I
were.
don't think
Okay, interesting. Okay. Um, well, yeah, I do. My prediction is more of a broader scale. I do think Mamdani's going to take it on November 4th. I think that he's going to win the election.
so.
I didn't necessarily. I thought that there was still hope, but I'm pretty confident now that he's going to. Um, and I think that I write about this in my book, but I think it's going to be one of these things where, we're going to have this, Republican president, Trump. To me, Mamdani is kind of like the anti-Trump. They're both very charismatic figures. Mamdani's a very charismatic figure. He also ran a great campaign. He had great ads. There's a lot to look at and to model,
Yeah,
and to kind of inspiration to take from that campaign because he really did galvanize people.
right.
And he did put together something that really worked. He probably had the money to do it. But he's kind of like the anti-Trump. And so I feel like with this kind of, I've thought so many times over the past number of years, and I've said this before, but just of Newton's third law of motion. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And so I see us, in the middle are the politically homeless folks just getting ping-ponged back and forth between these two extremes
Between Trump and Mamdani.
that are going to keep reacting to
Yeah.
each other. It's like, I mean, Martin Gurry wrote in that New York Times piece, I think, saying that like, oh, kind of people understood Trump to be a kind of response, a reaction to Obama's 8 year long, pushing for a more liberal, and kind of all these reforms and so on. And then, there's this response and then back and forth and then Mamdani. And it's just the parties are kind of really reacting to each other and and that's how it's been. It's not necessarily been like, oh, let's be the most pragmatic and formulate a really good plan. Like let's figure out like how to beat the other side and kind of react to what they're doing so that we can, put together a platform. And I just don't think it's been going on for a long time, but I just don't think that that's viable in the long term. I think that I would venture to say that that's like a newer development in terms of how politics operate at the national and local level. That it is more of partisan reactions to the opposite party, less than it is about like let's put together a really quality platform and figure out like who we are and where we are, especially because the country and each places are just so polarized and so divided, and so they are so desperate to get that vote and to get those folks on into their tribe, to get them into office.
Pulling in these opposite
So
directions.
I just think what I'm thinking is that it's just going to get essentially much crazier from here. I do think we're going to have the socialist mayor in New York, in the
Probably.
most populous city in the country, and then we're going to have Trump in office, and then indictments going on of the Clintons and so on, and all of these things. So yeah, it's going to get nuts.
Well, it'll make for good conversation and good
Mhm.
fodder for a podcast.
It will.
Um, okay, gentlemen, shall we
Yeah, let's wrap it up.
let's wrap it up, but it doesn't have to be all politics all the time for folks who have tuned in and stuck with us for our inaugural episode. We're going to cover a lot of different topics. But definitely New York focused because we are three New Yorkers. So there'll be for the New Yorkers watching or the people who like New York or love to hate New York, there'll be plenty to love and to hate in New York coming up. And I'm excited to keep talking to you guys.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for listening to this first episode, and hopefully, I know we're going to continue to put together some really great stuff for you, and so we're just going to keep going on and upwards from here. Have a great week, guys.
Yeah.
Yep. Have a
Have
great
a
week,
great week.
everyone.